Hello, in this video we're going to talk about infectious agents that are fungi. So previously we've talked about infectious agents that are protists. This lecture will cover fungi, and then in another lecture I'll talk about infectious agents that are animals. So mycology is the fancy name for the study of fungi. And fungi are all united by the fact that they all share a common type of nutrition. They are all heterotrophic, so they're not autotrophic. So a lot of times people have the misconception that fungi are like plants and they use photosynthesis, but they're not autotrophic. They are heterotrophic. Basically, a fungus absorbs nutrients from the environment outside of its body. So it's a form of external digestion that occurs followed by absorption. Most fungi do eat dead material, and that's where the term saprobe comes from. It's referring to absorbing that dead, broken down material. All right, in terms of reproduction, fungi are all capable of reproducing sexually, though many fungi are also capable of asexual reproduction. So when it comes to reproducing asexually, the fungus can use fragmentation or budding, which we've talked about in a previous video, but just a quick reminder. Fragmentation is when the organism splits into parts and each part grows into a new organism, whereas budding is when a small structure starts to grow on the organism and then that small structure breaks away and becomes a new organism. But fungi also reproduce asexually using spores. So spores are haploid cells that grow into new individuals, and it is considered asexual reproduction. These asexual spores are all genetically identical to the parent, which was why it's considered asexual. Because remember, with sexual reproduction, you get that genetic diversity. With asexual reproduction, everything is identical. So when it comes to the different types of fungi, we're most familiar with like a mushroom, right? You go to the store, you go to the grocery section, and well, back prior to coronavirus, we could find mushrooms in the fresh produce section. Maybe not now, but anyways, that particular mushroom belongs to a group called Basidocarps. And basically, that mushroom cap that we eat is the structure that actually produces the spores, and it can also produce the gametes if the mushroom is going to reproduce sexually. Typically, sexual reproduction only occurs in fungi under environmental stress. So when times are good, the fungus will just keep making identical copies of itself using spores, because if it's successful in that current environment, you don't really need the diversity. You can just make the same type of organism over and over and over again. So you can use that asexual reproduction. But like if something changes in the environment, like changes with temperature or moisture or something, that could be a stress on the fungus, and then it might reproduce sexually. All right, so looking at some basics with fungus structure, or morphology, if you will. Fungi can be multicellular or unicellular. So most fungi are multicellular, but the yeasts are a group of fungus that are unicellular. So we looked at those in our microscopy lab, which seems like eons ago, right? The basic structure of a fungus is something called mycelium. And the mycelium is usually a part of the fungus that we don't see. So most of the time when we think of fungi, right, we think of mushrooms. And the structure that we see for the mushroom, like I said, that is the structure that's for reproduction. The mycelium, which is the main body of the fungus, is usually underground or in the tree or the dead piece of wood, and you can't even see it because it's within another structure. And the mycelium is the main part of the fungus, the main body of the fungus. So that mass of fungal tissue is the mycelium, but the individual parts of the mycelium are called hyphae. Right? So hyphae make up the mycelium. So the bodies of a fungus are typically like a network of tiny filaments called hyphae. It's really a chain of cells, and the cell has a structure outside of it for protection called a cell wall, and the cell wall is made of something called chitin. And chitin is important because it's very strong but flexible, and it's actually more of a sugar than any other type of substance, so it's what we call a polysaccharide. So it's a strong but flexible polysaccharide. It's also found in the exoskeleton of arthropods, which we'll talk about in another lecture. So these hyphae with their chitinous cell walls get into large groups called the mycelium, and the mycelium is the part of the fungus that's going to infiltrate the material on which the fungus is feeding. Okay, now let's take a look at some of the infectious fungi. So most infectious fungi occur on the skin. Common types of fungal infections on the skin include jock itch, athlete's foot, ringworm, just to name a few. But fungal infections can occur internally too. So an example of that would be like thrush or vaginal yeast infections. And there's even some types of fungi that can cause pneumonia. Some people that have AIDS, which is that acquired immunodeficiency syndrome that comes about from the HIV virus, those individuals aren't able to fight off fungal pneumonia like other people can because they have a reduced immune system, and sometimes they'll develop that unusual fungal pneumonia. So of course, pictures, yay! All right, so this one would be jock itch up here. Horrible case of athlete's foot. Here we have ringworm, which looks a little bit like Lyme disease. We'll talk about that in another lecture, but ringworm is actually not a worm at all. It's a fungus. This is thrush over here. And then, of course, you can have yeast that grow in abundance in the vagina, and that would be a yeast infection. Okay, now let's talk about fungus other than in health and disease. So we're going to talk about non-infectious fungi now. So fungi are obviously very important as a food source for humans and other organisms, right? So mushrooms have a lot of health benefits to them, right? They're very low calorie, cholesterol free, fat free, sodium free, though to taste good, we usually have to add some sodium, but they are a good food source. Yeast, which are a type of fungi, are really important for the beer and wine industry, and I guess liquor too, because that's how we can make those products, is using a process called fermentation. Fermentation is something that can occur in yeast, bacteria, and other organisms. And some forms of fermentation involve the production of a byproduct called alcohol. So that's how we can use yeast to make things like beer and wine. Yeast are very important in ecosystems as decomposers or detritivores. So they help to break down those various organic materials in ecosystems, which is important for the cycle of nutrients in an ecosystem. Oh, down here at the bottom, we see corn, right? You might have heard of these products. So these meatless meat products are becoming more and more popular. And corn is a brand of meatless meat products that is actually made from mushrooms. I shouldn't say mushrooms, it's made from a fungus. All right, this one I just find particularly interesting. What we're looking at here is a type of fungus that actually forms traps, right? So there are predatory fungi that lay these like loopy traps with their hyphae to trap roundworms, and then they will externally digest the roundworm and then absorb those nutrients, which is kind of crazy. All right, lichens. So lichens are really important in ecology too. So a lichen is actually like a merger between a fungus and then an algae or a cyanobacterium. So a lichen always has fungus as its main component, but then it's merged with a photosynthetic algae or a photosynthetic bacterium like cyanobacterium. So lichens are actually given their own scientific names as if they were a single organism, even though they are actually composed of two different organisms, which is kind of interesting. There's over 17,000 different species of lichen that have been described, so there's quite a few of these. In most lichens, each partner is providing something that the other could not obtain on its own. So in this lichen relationship, what's happening is the photosynthetic organism, which would be the algae or the cyanobacterium, is producing carbon compounds like glucose that the fungus can use. The fungus, in turn, is basically providing a home for the algae or cyanobacterium, so it's kind of protecting it. But additionally, the fungus is producing some nutrients that the algae or cyanobacterium need. So there's that nice mutualistic relationship between the two. Lichens are really important as pioneers in ecosystems that have been cleared away. So this could happen like a fire, right? Let's say a fire occurs and now you're working off of like ground zero for an ecosystem. So lichens are often the first or pioneer organism to appear. This can also happen on bare rock. So like say a volcano goes off in the ocean and you get a new island that's formed. So you first start with rock, and then the first major living organism in the ecosystem to pioneer that rock is going to be a lichen. These species are really important because they help to further break down the mineral-rich substances in the volcanic rock or that bare soil where other organisms probably couldn't survive. So basically the lichen are the first ones to move in, and then they create a different type of environment, and now other organisms will be able to move in. All right, a couple other things involving fungi. I just wanted to mention fairy rings. I don't know why fairy rings gross me out. It's one of those things that gives me the heebie-jeebies. I know it doesn't mean anything, but I just don't like mushrooms growing in circles. It just bothers me. The fact that they grow overnight too is kind of weird. I don't know. I just wanted to mention them. And then another sort of anomaly here is the humongous fungus. And the humongous fungus is actually the world's largest fungus. It covers over 2,000 acres, and it's the largest known root disease in all of the world. And I believe that's, yeah, we have it right here. So this is in Oregon, right? And so it's actually something that's found in Oregon. Oh, and this is sort of interesting. So when I was doing some research on this humongous fungus, I came across some information about projections on the suitable climate for this this fungus. So this is the area where this fungus currently inhabits. And this is where they think that the humongous fungus is going to be found in 2070, so 50 years from now. And so you see a significant shift northward, right? So we're moving out of Oregon and even out of Washington up way more into Canada. And why is that happening? If you said climate change, you would be correct. All right, another interesting thing involving fungus is leafcutter ants. So leafcutter ants are a type of ant that actually farms fungus, right? So that's what we see here. We see the queen ant and then worker ants, and then we see the fungus that they have been farming, right? So it's sort of an interesting thing. Humans were the only farmers. Well, we're not. And another interesting thing involving mushrooms, of course, is that some mushrooms have within them psychedelic substances. So there's a substance called psilocin that's found in many different types of mushrooms. And basically, it can act on a type of receptor in our brain called a serotonin receptor. And it increases the amount of serotonin that's available in the brain. And this produces very profound changes in perception, which is where the psychedelic component comes from with this substance. And the last thing we're going to talk about with fungi is something called mycorrhizae. And these are actually really, really important in biology. This is another example of a mutualistic relationship, but in this case, it's between a fungus and a plant, specifically the plant roots. Actually, the term mycorrhizae actually means fungus roots. So in the picture here, we see two plugs of grass. And in one case, you have grass that's growing quite nicely. and the other case, the grass doesn't look so hot. And if you look at the grass that's growing quite nicely, you'll notice a lot more white stuff in the roots, and that would be the fungus, right? So this is my Mycorrhizae fungus. And these fungi can massively improve the delivery of phosphate ions and other minerals to the roots of the plant, and that's what really helps the plants to grow. There's a great deal of evidence that clearly demonstrates that these mycorrhizae are really important for plant nutrition, especially if we're trying to grow plants in a very nutrient-poor soil. So, like for example, many species of trees and shrubs can be grown in a greenhouse, but if these are then transplanted into an abandoned pasture or prairie or some other, sort of deficient habitat, they commonly fail to survive and grow, and they show signs of nutritional distress. This happens because the soils of those habitats do not have populations of fungi growing in the soil, and so we can't form those mycorrhizae fungal plant root relationships, right? If the seedlings are to do well in such habitats, they must be deliberately inoculated, so we have to add in the mycorrhizae fungus. So just sort of a very interesting yet really important thing for plant growth. And most plants do have these mycorrhizae fungi. All right, so that's it. We've covered protists and fungi, and next up will be infectious animals.